To many, the countryside is just an empty space between our towns and cities. To others, this same emptiness is what makes it so special. It is a place left largely alone by people, where nature flourishes and wildlife thrives. Our perception of the countryside is so centred around fields full of wheat and sheep, but it's difficult to imagine that once it wasn't like this. In ancient times, up to 75% of our country was covered in woodland, and now that number sits at just 13%. So what is the impact of this change on our native plant and animal life? To find out, I'll be surveying some of the country's last remaining natural woodland and comparing it to some nearby farmland in order to assess the impact of human activity on biodiversity across the UK. First, I'll be visiting the Outwoods in the Charnwood Forest region of Leicestershire. The woods are split into two sections, an old growth forest made up of some of the last remaining ancient woodland in the country, and a newer section made up of pine trees originally planted for logging. Much of the forested area of the UK is made up of similar pine plantations, including the enormous Kielder forest along the border of Scotland. So it will be interesting to see the effect these unnatural trees have on the local wildlife. First, the old growth section of the woods. The trees in this area are mostly rowan, silver birch and oak, which foster a rich undergrowth thick with brambles and ferns. This environment allows for a large population of bird and small mammals, as well as a population of deer kept in a private section of the woodland. Whilst it is maintained regularly, this part of the Outwoods is ancient woodland and some of the closest remaining land in the UK to the natural forest. To survey this area, as well as the pine wood on the farm, I used a technique called quadrat sampling, counting the various plant species across several random square metre sections of the woodland and using them to find an average for the biodiversity across the entire wood. It is only possible to survey plant biodiversity using this method, but an ecosystem home to many different types of plants will generally foster high animal biodiversity as well. Using the data gathered with this method, it is possible to calculate an index of diversity which takes into account the number of different species and the population of each species to create a ranking system that rewards a truly balanced ecosystem, with healthy populations of several different species. This index of diversity results in a value between 0 and 1, where 0 is an environment with just one native species, and 1 would be theoretically infinitely diverse. Using this scale, the old growth forest of the Outwood scores a respectable 0.75. It is important to remember that this high score represents what once covered the majority of the country. It is obvious even without the diversity index that this section of woodland has more life in it than anywhere else. The undergrowth is thick with plant life and the signs of small animals present, and there is not a second where you cannot hear a chorus of birdsong. It is this birdsong, or lack thereof, that brings us to the stark contrast with the newer pine section of the woods. One thing that is immediately clear about this part of the woods is how quiet it is. You don't really notice the birds until suddenly there are so few of them, and there is something quite eerie about the near silence that replaces them. The forest floor is home to little more than moss and the occasional fern, as well as some larger holly bushes. It is clear that the pine trees do not foster an ecosystem anywhere near as well as the natural woodland does, and the biodiversity score of just 0.37 confirms this. Because of this, the Outwoods have been gradually replacing the old pine trees with natural species, and while this process takes a long time, a simple walk through both sections of the woods shows that it is definitely worth it. The fact that so much of our woodland across the country is made up of similar pine plantations shows how bad the situation truly is, and highlights how further conservation efforts like the ones of the Outwoods are desperately needed across the country. The last area I surveyed was this wheat field just outside of the Outwoods. The crop had, by this time of year, already been harvested, and so the field had been left to grow naturally to an extent. Despite this, the effects of farming in this field were definitely noticeable. The only plants growing here were varieties suited to low soil nutrients, as the ground had not yet had time to recover following the year's crop. Rejuvenation of soil nutrients can be accomplished naturally using crop rotation, planting certain crops on a yearly cycle that release nutrients such as nitrates back into the soil, but many farmers choose instead to use artificial fertilizers so that they can grow their main crop every year. This can have an incredibly damaging effect on nearby ecosystems. If it rains soon after the fertilizer is sprayed, it can be washed away into nearby rivers and ponds, leading to what's known as algae bloom, where green algae is able to absorb the nutrients quickly, rapidly growing to cover the entire water surface. This blocks out sunlight, killing other aquatic plants and the animals that in turn depend on them. This creates a cycle that can quickly destroy an entire ecosystem. This particular field was home to a large population of crickets and several plant species which were seemingly largely absent from the woods. So it is clear that this type of grassland does have a part to play in the wider countrywide ecosystem, and indeed the field scored 0.55 diversity score, better than the pine woodland. Despite this, the effects of intense farming methods and the sheer amount of land covered by monoculture fields in the UK is definitely detrimental to nature across the country. While it may at first appear that weakening biodiversity only matters to insects and birds, the effect on people is becoming ever more real and damaging with each year. Bees are crucial for pollination of crops. Forests and tree roots are essential for prevention of land erosion and control of flooding, and ecosystems carefully balance the number of certain species that, if left unchecked by nature, can wreak havoc on our crops. The effects of crop failures and increasingly severe natural disasters would not only affect people and their livelihoods directly, but also have drastic knock-on effects across wider society. All of these problems are closely linked with both reckless disregard for nature and industries across the country, and also with a wider and ever-looming problem of global climate change. Our society is far more linked with nature and climate at every level than we have ever realised until recently, and this has only become more obvious as we have begun to chip away at the knife edge upon which everything is carefully balanced. The nature of the world in which we'll grow up hangs in the balance, and with each passing day the deadline to choose creeps ever closer. Will our grandchildren be born into a world where we learn to coexist with nature, or into one where food is sometimes scarce and successful harvests aren't guaranteed, where natural disasters grow ever more damaging and frequent, and where much of our beloved wildlife only exists in history books? This is our choice to make, and it isn't going to be easy, but what can you, personally, do to help? On a small scale, leaving a small section of garden to grow wild can be an effective way of encouraging local wildlife. Long grasses and wildflowers not only look pretty, but are favourites among insects such as bees and other small animals. If you don't have a garden, a windowsill planter box is an effective way of bringing just a small bit of nature into the heart of urban areas, and can make all the difference. Thinking bigger, there are many countrywide and local environmental groups that are always looking for volunteers. This is probably the most effective way to help out at the local level, and can be a fun way to meet new people and try new things, from simple litter picking to more directly involved conservation efforts. Finally, being conscious of the environment politically is probably the best way of being impactful in the long term, meaning considering the environment when you decide who to vote for, but also getting involved politically in other ways. Campaigning and signing petitions can often seem ineffective, but the only way that changes is through more people getting involved. Which brings you to the last important point, which is to encourage others to also get involved. Be it your friends or family, the more people there are who are willing to strive for a positive future, the better.